I didn't find out through a scandalous letter or a whispered rumor from a kitchen maid. I found out because of a teacup. For 3 years, my husband strictly forbade lemon in his tea. He said the acidity ruined the delicate leaves. But when she walked into our parlor, damp from the rain and shivering, he didn't even ask. He simply poured the tea, sliced the lemon, and handed it to her. That was the exact moment I knew. I was merely the understudy. It is a strange thing to build a life on the foundation of someone else's silence. For 3 years, I believed my marriage to Nathaniel the Duke of Whitmore was a triumph of pragmatism over passion. We were not the subjects of breathless gossip. We did not share stolen glances across crowded ballrooms, nor did we tear at each other's clothing in the dimly lit corridors of his ancestral estate. Our beginning was a transaction signed in a heavy oak-panelled room smelling of floor wax and my father's stale cigar smoke. I came with a substantial dowry of coal-rich land. Nathaniel came with a title older than the trees in his sprawling park and an estate desperately leaking money through its slate roofs. I was 22, pragmatic to a fault, and thoroughly unremarkable. My hair was a dull, heavy brown that resisted pins my shoulders, a fraction too broad for the delicate silks currently in fashion in London. I did not possess the kind of beauty that ruined men. I possessed the kind of competence that kept them comfortable. When I moved into Whitmore Manor, I found a house holding its breath. The staff spoke in hushed tones. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn against the afternoon sun. The place smelled of old dust, damp wool, and something vaguely metallic like cold iron left out in the frost. Nathaniel matched the house. He was a tall man, lean and angular, with eyes the colour of a winter sea. He moved quietly, spoke softly, and possessed a deeply entrenched melancholy that I, in my naive arrogance, thought I could slowly dismantle. I went to work. I threw open the windows to let the crisp country air chase away the stagnation. I fired the lazy steward, rolled up my sleeves, and spent my mornings with ink staining my fingertips balancing ledgers that had been neglected for half a decade. I ordered the chimneys swept. I commanded the gardeners to tame the overgrown grounds. And slowly, the house began to breathe again. And slowly, I thought Nathaniel began to look at me. Our intimacy was built on routine. It was the predictable clink of silver against porcelain at breakfast. It was the scent of his shaving soap, sharp peppermint and cedar lingering in the hallway. It was the heavy, warm weight of him beside me in the massive four-poster bed at night. He was a gentle lover, meticulous and polite, though his eyes were often squeezed shut in the dark. I didn't mind. I told myself that passion was a volatile, destructive thing. What we had was a fire built for warmth, not for burning the house down. I molded myself to his preferences, believing I was carving out a space for myself in his heart. I prefer white roses, Beatrice, he had said mildly one afternoon as we walked the neglected terrace. The red ones are too loud. I spent 2 years painstakingly cultivating a massive garden of white roses. I learned to prune them myself. My hands bore the tiny white scars of their thorns, a physical testament to my devotion. Lavender, he murmured, once his nose brushing my neck after I had bathed. It suits you. I threw away my expensive jasmine perfumes. I bathed in lavender water. I kept dried sprigs of it in my linen drawers. I smelled of it permanently, a walking, breathing monument to his offhand preference. I drank my tea plain, because he disliked the smell of sugar and lemon in the parlour. I wore pale blues and soft greys, because he once mentioned that bright colours gave him a headache. I eroded my own edges to fit perfectly into the hollow space beside him, and I was proud of the fit. I thought it meant I was a good wife. I thought the occasional distant look in his eyes when he stared out the drawing-room window was just the burden of his title. I would watch him trace the heavy gold signet ring on his right hand, his jaw ticking, and I would feel a swell of quiet, protective affection. I believed I was enough to anchor him. I was the solid ground beneath his feet. I didn't know he was only ever looking at the horizon waiting for a ghost to walk over it. Her name was Genevieve. I only knew it from a single locked drawer in his study that I had accidentally bumped into while cleaning and a hastily covered ledger entry from years before we met. A cousin's widow, a political exile, a fleeting mention by a drunken uncle at our wedding, who was quickly shooshed. I hadn't asked. I was too proud, too secure in my ledgers and my white roses and my lavender soap. I didn't care about the women who came before me because I was the one wearing the ring. That was my first mistake. Assuming that presence equated to permanence. It was a Tuesday in late October. The sky over the estate was the colour of a bruised plum, swollen and heavy, threatening a downpour that finally broke just past 3 in the afternoon. The rain did not fall. It threw itself against the glass panes of the manor like gravel. The wind howled through the chimneys, bringing with it the sharp scent of wet earth and dying leaves. I was in the library, a wool shawl pulled tightly around my shoulders, verifying the grain yields from our eastern tenant farms. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, erratic shadows across the bookshelves. It was a perfectly ordinary, perfectly safe afternoon. Then the dogs started barking. It wasn't their usual lazy woof at a passing fox. It was a frantic, chaotic clamour echoing from the main foyer. I set my pen down. The ink left a tiny dark period on the page. I rubbed my eyes, feeling the grit of exhaustion in them, and stood up my heavy wool skirt, swishing against the floorboards. By the time I reached the top of the grand staircase, the massive oak front doors had already been hauled open by Thomas, our butler. The wind ripped into the hall, nearly extinguishing the wall sconces, and sending a spray of cold rain across the polished marble. A carriage stood in the driveway, its horses stamping and steaming in the cold air. The driver was hauling a leather trunk from the back, but my eyes were not on the carriage. A woman stood in our foyer. She was soaked to the bone. A heavy, dark travelling cloak clung to her slender frame, dripping water into a dark puddle on the marble. The hood had fallen back, revealing hair that was plastered to her skull and neck, a startling luminous shade of pale gold, even in the gloom. I began to descend the stairs, the words of a polite, authoritative hostess forming on my tongue. "Who are you? Are you lost? Bring her a towel, Thomas." Before I could reach the midway landing, the door to Nathaniel's study banged open. He stepped out, irritation etched into his features at the noise. He was holding a stack of papers, his spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose. He looked up, ready to scold the servants. He saw her. I stopped walking. I stopped breathing. I watched a man I had known intimately for 3 years entirely disintegrate and reassemble himself in the span of 3 seconds. The papers slipped from his hands, scattering across the floor with soft, wet slaps. He didn't blink. The muscles in his throat worked convulsively, an involuntary swallow. Every line of tension, every stoic boundary he had erected over the years vanished. He looked suddenly terrifyingly young. "Genevieve," he whispered. He didn't shout it. It was a breathless exhalation, a sound torn from the deepest, most heavily guarded vault of his chest. It barely carried over the sound of the rain, but it hit me like a physical blow to the ribs. She swayed. She looked exhausted, her face pale and drawn shadows bruised beneath her large eyes. "Nathaniel," she rasped. Her voice was husky raw. "I had nowhere else to go. He is dead. I am sorry to intrude. I didn't know." She didn't finish the sentence. She started to collapse, a graceful crumpling of wet fabric. Nathaniel moved faster than I had ever seen him move. He crossed the foyer in 3 long strides, catching her before her knees hit the stone. He fell to the floor with her, uncaring of the mud or the water. He pulled her against his chest, his large hands frantically sweeping the wet hair from her face. "You're freezing," he muttered, his voice trembling. "Thomas, get Mrs. Hughes. Have a fire lit in the east wing immediately. Bring blankets. God, Evie, you're like ice." Evie. I stood on the stairs, a large, solid, unremarkable woman in a sensible brown dress, holding onto the banister so tightly, my knuckles ached. He was stripping off his own fitted wool jacket, wrapping it tightly around her shivering shoulders. I remembered a time early in our marriage when our carriage had broken down in the snow. I had shivered for an hour. Nathaniel had sat opposite me, politely concerned, and offered to close the window blind. He had never offered me his coat. I forced myself to walk down the remaining steps. My boots felt like they were made of lead. Every scuff of my heel seemed obscenely loud, but neither of them looked up. "Nathaniel," I said. My voice was steady. It was the voice of the woman who balanced the ledgers and scolded the butcher. It lacked poetry. He finally looked up at me. For a fraction of a second, I saw profound, unfiltered annoyance in his eyes, a stranger interrupting a sacred moment. Then reality crashed back into him. The mask slammed back into place, but clumsily. "Beatrice," he said, clearing his throat. He did not let go of Genevieve. This is Lady Genevieve Sterling, a childhood friend. Her husband passed away recently in France. She requires our hospitality." Genevieve turned her head, resting it against his chest. She looked up at me. Her eyes were a stunning, vivid violet blue framed by wet, dark lashes. Even exhausted, shivering, and soaked in mud, she possessed a fragile, devastating beauty. She was a porcelain doll. I was a brick wall. "Your Grace," she whispered to me, "I am so terribly sorry. I didn't mean to burden your home." "Nonsense," I heard myself say. My tone was crisp, efficient, the perfect duchess. "Whitmore Manor is always a haven for my husband's friends. Let us get you out of those wet things." They moved to the parlour to wait for the room to be readied. I followed. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. Genevieve sat on the settee, wrapped in Nathaniel's coat. That was when the teacup incident occurred. Thomas brought a silver tray. Without a word, without looking at me or asking for her preference, Nathaniel poured the tea. He picked up the silver tongs, selected a thick slice of lemon, dropped it into her cup, and handed it to her. His fingers lingered against hers for a second longer than necessary. I stood by the fireplace, the heat scorching the back of my legs, and felt a cold sweat break out along my spine. He forbade lemon. He said it ruined the leaves. He hadn't forbidden it because of the tea. He had forbidden it because the smell of it reminded him of her. And my lack of it was just another space he kept empty, waiting for her return. Dinner that evening was an exercise in sophisticated psychological torture. The storm raged on outside, rattling the tall windows of the dining room. Inside, the massive crystal chandelier cast a harsh, unforgiving light over the long mahogany table. I sat at the foot. Nathaniel sat at the head. Genevieve sat to his right. She had been bathed and dressed in one of my old gowns. Because her trunks had fallen into a flooded ditch during her journey, I had instructed my maid to alter a dress I hadn't worn in years, a pale, shimmering blue silk. It was a dress Nathaniel had bought for me during our first year in London. I had worn it proudly, thinking the colour pleased him. Seeing it on Genevieve, I realised the truth with a sickening thud in my stomach. The bodice, which had always been a fraction too tight across my ribs, fit her delicate frame perfectly. The colour made her violet eyes luminous. He hadn't bought it for me. He had bought it because it was a dress Genevieve would have worn. I had been walking around wearing the ghost of his dead romance. "The roast is excellent, Beatrice," Nathaniel said. I looked up from my plate. I hadn't tasted a single bite. The roasted mutton and rosemary tasted like wet ash in my mouth. "Thank you," I replied evenly, setting my silver knife down. The scrape against the porcelain was sharp. "Our new cook is quite adept." Nathaniel was transformed. The quiet, stoic man I had lived with for 3 years was gone. In his place was a vibrant, animated stranger. He was leaning forward, his elbows on the table, a breach of etiquette he would usually silently condemn. His eyes, usually a flat, stormy grey, were bright. He asked Genevieve about Paris. He asked about mutual acquaintances I had never heard of. He laughed. It was a deep, resonant, chest-rumbling sound. I stared at him. In 3 years, I could count the number of times he had smiled on one hand. I had never, not once, heard him laugh like that. I felt ugly. I felt entirely, profoundly inadequate. I was suddenly hyper-aware of my broad hands, the small ink stain near my thumbnail, the practical severe cut of my dark green evening gown. "I must say, Nathaniel," Genevieve said softly, taking a sip of her wine. She touched the rim of the glass with a slender, pale finger. "The estate looks beautiful, better than I remember. When I left, it was so gloomy." "Beatrice has worked miracles with the staff," Nathaniel said. He threw me a brief polite smile, the kind you give a competent employee. She is highly organized. Organized, not beautiful, not brilliant, not cherished. Organized. Genevieve turned her large eyes to me. You must have the patience of a saint, Your Grace. Nat was always so stubbornly attached to his gloom. I remember trying to get him to open the curtains in the south drawing room when we were 20. He sulked for a week. Nat. She called him Nat. I called him Nathaniel. I had never dared shorten his name. It felt like a liberty he had not granted me. One learns to adapt, Lady Genevieve, I said, picking up my wineglass to hide the slight tremor in my hand. Oh, please call me Evie. Everyone does. She smiled, a sad, sweet thing. Then she looked toward the window out into the pitch-black, rain-lashed night. I saw the gardens as we drove in, even in the storm. All those white roses. They survived. My heart stopped. Pardon. I managed to push the word past the tight constriction in my throat. Genevieve looked back at me, her expression entirely innocent. The white roses. When Nat and I were young before I married Lord Stirling, we planted a row of white roses near the old fountain. I always loved them. I was so afraid they would have died out by now. I'm so glad you kept them, Your Grace. I didn't look at Genevieve. I slowly turned my head and looked down the long expanse of the table at my husband. Nathaniel was staring at his plate. He had stopped chewing. A dull flush crept up the back of his neck, disappearing into his collar. He would not meet my eyes. He gripped his heavy linen napkin so tightly his knuckles were white. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the relentless drumming of the rain. Every memory of the last 3 years began to recontextualize itself in a violent, dizzying rush. The white roses weren't his preference. They were a monument to her. The lavender soap. I remembered with a wave of pure nausea unpacking Genevieve's damp cloak in the foyer. The faint, sweet smell clinging to the wool beneath the scent of rain. Lavender. The blue dress. The quietness. He wasn't naturally silent. He was just mourning. He wasn't comfortable. He was merely tolerating the void until it could be filled again. I had spent 3 years meticulously building a house brick by brick, entirely unaware that I was constructing a shrine to another woman. I was not his partner. I was the caretaker of his grief. I was the placeholder. The humiliation was a physical agony. It burned in the back of my eyes and clawed at my throat. But beneath the humiliation, a slow, freezing anger began to pool in my stomach. I was practical. I did not throw tantrums. I stood up. My chair scraped loudly against the floor. Both of them jumped slightly. I find I am suddenly quite fatigued, I said. My voice was eerily calm, detached from the violent storm raging inside my ribs. The ledgers took a toll today. Please excuse me. Evie, ensure you take a hot brick to bed tonight to ward off the damp. Nathaniel will show you where the extra blankets are kept. Beatrice. Nathaniel started half rising from his chair. His voice carried a note of panic. Not because he was worried about me, I realized with brutal clarity, but because he knew he had been caught. The illusion was shattered. Enjoy your evening, I said softly. I turned and walked out of the dining room. I kept my back perfectly straight. I did not run. I walked at a measured, deliberate pace, holding my breath until I was safely around the corner and out of their sight. When I reached the heavy oak door of my bedchamber, I finally let out a jagged, shuddering breath. I walked inside and locked the door. I walked past my bed straight to the washstand. There, sitting on the marble rim, was a fresh bar of expensive lavender soap. I picked it up. It smelled sweet. It smelled like obedience. It smelled like her. I threw it into the fireplace, watching it hit the burning logs and begin to melt, sizzling and hissing, filling the room with a sickly, overwhelming perfume that I swore to myself I would never wear again. I woke to a room that smelled violently of burnt lavender and wood smoke. My mouth was dry-tasting of stale wine and copper. I lay perfectly still in the center of the massive cold mattress, staring up at the velvet canopy. My chest felt hollowed out as if a butcher had taken a clean knife and scooped out my lungs during the night. A lesser woman, or perhaps a more romantic one, might have wept. She might have torn her hair, hurled a porcelain vase at the mirror, or run weeping to her husband to demand an explanation. But I was the daughter of a coal baron. I was raised in a house where weakness was a liability and tears did not balance the quarterly accounts. I sat up. The air in the unlit room was freezing, raising gooseflesh along my arms. When my maid Martha entered half an hour later with a pitcher of warm water, she found me standing before my open wardrobe. "Your Grace," Martha asked softly, setting the pitcher on the washstand. She glanced at the blackened lump in the fireplace, then quickly averted her eyes. Servants always knew. The house was a living organism. It felt every shift in the air. "Martha," I said, my voice crackling slightly from disuse. "Take all the pale blue, grey and cream gowns, pack them in trunks, have them sent to the parish charity by noon." Martha blinked her hands, pausing on the linen towel. "All of them, ma'am, but that is nearly your entire afternoon wardrobe." "I am aware." I pulled out a heavy, dark burgundy wool dress. It was severely cut, devoid of lace or ribbon. It was the dress of a woman who meant to do business, not a woman who meant to be admired. "And fetch me the harsh lye soap from the scullery." I have developed a sudden aversion to floral scents. I washed with punishing vigor. The lye soap was rough and unscented, stinging the small abrasions on my knuckles where I had pruned her white roses just days before. I scrubbed my neck and my arms until the skin was flushed and raw, until I smelled of nothing but clean, sharp soap and my own sweat. I would not be an echo anymore. If I was to occupy this house, I would take up my own space. Breakfast was served in the small morning room, a space that caught the thin, grey autumn light. When I walked in, they were already there. They were seated close together at the round table. Nathaniel was reading a passage from a newspaper, his voice a low, soothing murmur. Genevieve was leaning on her elbows, watching his mouth as he spoke. They looked like a painting. They looked complete. I walked in the heavy soles of my leather boots, clocking sharply against the floorboards. The reading stopped. "Good morning," I said briskly, taking my seat opposite them. Nathaniel looked at me, and I saw his eyes snag on my dress. He frowned slightly. The burgundy wool swallowed the light. It made my shoulders look broader, my posture uncompromising. "You are not wearing your blue silk." He noted a hint of confusion in his tone. "No," I replied, reaching for the silver bell to summon the footman. I found it suddenly suffocating. Genevieve offered a small tentative smile. She was wearing one of my cream day dresses, the lace collar framing her delicate jaw. "It is a cold morning. Wool is much more sensible." Sensible. The word grated against my spine. Thomas entered. "Your Grace." "Coffee, Thomas," I said smoothly. "Black. And have the cook prepare eggs with cracked pepper and sharp cheddar." Nathaniel lowered his newspaper entirely. "Coffee? Beatrice, you detest coffee. It is much too bitter. And you always take mild tea in the morning." I met his gaze. His winter sea eyes were entirely bewildered. It was almost comical how little he truly knew me, how easily he had mistaken my accommodations for my personality. "I have decided I require something with a bite," I said, holding his stare until he was the one who looked away, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. "A palate cleanser, if you will." I turned my attention to my plate. The silence that settled over the table was thick and suffocating, but for the first time in 3 years, I was not the one suffocating. I ate my eggs. I drank the scalding bitter coffee. It tasted like ash and earth, and it was the most magnificent thing I had ever consumed. After breakfast, I did not go to the parlour to read. I put on a heavy woolen cloak and marched out into the biting wind, tracking mud against the hem of my skirt. I found Mr. Harrison, our head gardener, near the greenhouses. He was an old man, skin like tanned leather, who had worked for the Whitmores since Nathaniel was a boy. "Harrison," I called out over the roar of the wind. He tipped his cap. "Your Grace, a foul day for a walk." I turned and pointed toward the south terrace. The long, immaculate rows of white roses shivered in the gale. They were my pride. They were my labor. They were my humiliation. "Dig them up," I said. Harrison froze his spade, slipping in the wet earth. "Ma'am, the white roses. But you spent years coaxing them from the rot. They are the finest in the county. They are taking up valuable soil." I said, my voice flat, betraying none of the acid churning in my stomach. "Dig them up, every last root. Burn the briars. I want the soil turned over and prepared for spring." "What shall we plant instead, Your Grace?" he asked, looking at me as if I had gone mad. "Potatoes," I said. "Turnips. Something that actually feeds this estate, rather than merely sitting there looking pretty." I turned on my heel and walked away, the wind whipping my dark cloak around me like a storm cloud. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew the exact moment the first spade broke the earth, because I felt a phantom root snap somewhere deep inside my own chest. The house fractured into two distinct territories. The drawing rooms, the library, and the conservatory belonged to them. I would walk past closed mahogany doors and hear the soft lilting cadence of Genevieve's laugh, followed by the low rumbling timbre of Nathaniel's response. I would hear the pianoforte, always Chopin, always the melancholy nocturnes that Nathaniel claimed gave him a migraine when I attempted to play them. I realized he didn't hate the music. He had just hated my hands on the keys. I took the rest of the house. I took the kitchens, the estate office, the tenant farms, and the account books. I buried myself in the architecture of our survival. The truth was, Whitmore Manor was bleeding. Nathaniel's title was a grand gilded shield that hid a crumbling fortress. Before our marriage, the estate had been heavily mortgaged. My dowry, the dirty new money from my father's coal mines, had paid off the creditors, patched the slate roofs, and restocked the tenant farms. I held the purse strings, though I had always discreetly handed the coin to Nathaniel, so he could pretend he was the one paying the piper. I stopped handing him the coin. 3 days after the roses were dug up, I was sitting at the massive oak desk in the estate office. My fingers were stained with black ink. The fire was roaring, but the chill of the room still seeped through my heavy wool dress. The door opened without a knock. Nathaniel stepped in. He looked tired, but it was a different kind of exhaustion than the hollow, haunted look he had worn for the past 3 years. This was the exhaustion of a man who was acutely, painfully alive. He smelled of rain and faintly, maddeningly of lavender. "Beatrice," he said, closing the door behind him. He looked around the office as if he had never seen it before. In truth, he rarely came in here. The ledgers bored him. Nathaniel. I replied, not looking up. I dipped my pen into the inkwell. The scratch of the metal nib against the thick parchment was the only sound in the room for a long moment. He cleared his throat. "I have just spoken with the seamstress in the village. Genevieve's trunks were entirely ruined by the water damage. Her gowns are unsalvageable. I have told the seamstress to come up to the manor tomorrow to take her measurements for a new wardrobe." My pen paused. A small black drop of ink fell from the nib, blooming on the white paper like a tiny dark bruise. I slowly placed the pen down and looked up at him. He was avoiding my gaze, looking instead at the mounted stag's head above the fireplace. "A new wardrobe," I repeated, my voice terrifyingly calm. "Yes, it is only proper. She is our guest, and she has suffered a great tragedy." He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I recognized from our early days of marriage, when he had to ask me to approve a repair to the stables. "I will need you to authorize a draft from the household account. £50 should suffice for a modest selection." £50. A small fortune. Enough to repair the leaking roof in the eastern tenant cottages 3 times over. I felt a sudden hysterical urge to laugh. He was standing in the house my money had saved, asking me to use the wealth my coal-mining father had bled from the earth to buy silk gowns for the woman he actually loved. The audacity of his blindness was staggering. "No," I said. The word dropped into the room like a stone into a glassy pond. Nathaniel finally looked at me. His brow furrowed. No, Beatrice, be reasonable. The woman cannot wear your old cast-offs indefinitely. It is humiliating for her. It is humiliating for her, I asked, keeping my voice low. The anger inside me wasn't hot. It was glacial, carving out deep frozen canyons in my chest. Is that your primary concern? Nathaniel Genevieve's humiliation? She is a widow, Beatrice. She has nothing. She has an estate in France, I corrected smoothly, pulling a leather-bound ledger toward me. I took the liberty of wiring my father's solicitor in London to inquire about the late Lord Stirling's affairs. The estate is heavily taxed, yes, but she is hardly destitute. She is receiving a modest widow's pension, more than enough to purchase her own wool. Nathaniel's face darkened. A muscle ticked in his jaw. You had her investigated. I manage the finances of this estate, I said, closing the ledger with a sharp, definitive snap. I do not fund charities without investigating the beneficiaries. The household account does not have £50 to spare on French silk and lace. I am the Duke of Whitmore, he snapped, his voice rising, shedding the polite veneer he usually wore. And I say the money will be provided. I stood up. I was not a small woman. In my heavy boots and dark dress, I was nearly as tall as he was, and twice as solid. I walked around the massive desk, stopping a mere 2 feet from him. I could see the faint stubble on his chin, the panicked tightening of the skin around his eyes. You are the Duke of Whitmore. I agreed softly, looking dead into his eyes. But it is my name on the bank drafts in London. It is my father's coal that heats these rooms. It is my money that pays the butcher, the baker, and the seamstress. You may have the title Nathaniel, but I own the roof over your head. If you wish to clothe your mistress, you will have to find a way to pay for it yourself. Sell a horse, sell your signet ring, but you will not use my money to dress her. He flinched. The word mistress hung in the air between us, ugly and bare. She is not my mistress, he hissed, his face pale. How dare you speak of her that way? We are friends. We grew up together. Do not insult my intelligence, I whispered, stepping closer until I could smell the stale brandy on his breath. I spent 3 years wearing her colours, bathing in her scents, and cultivating her flowers, because you were too cowardly to mourn her openly. You built a ghost of her out of me. But the ghost is dead, Nathaniel. I am awake now, and the bank is closed. He stared at me, his chest heaving as if he were looking at a stranger. And perhaps he was. The compliant, desperate girl who had arrived here 3 years ago was gone. He turned on his heel and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the stag's head rattled on the wall. I stood in the middle of the quiet room, my hands shaking so violently I had to grip the edge of the desk to stay upright. I had won the skirmish, but the victory tasted like rust and salt. That night, the storm returned, rattling the window panes with aggressive bursts of sleet. I was sitting in my bedchamber, staring into the fire. I had not gone down to dinner. I had instructed Martha to bring a tray of cold meats and bread to my room. I chewed the bread mechanically, swallowing past the tight, dry knot in my throat. At midnight, the handle of my door turned. It wasn't locked. I hadn't thought to lock it. Nathaniel walked in. He did not knock. He was not wearing his jacket or his cravat. His white linen shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the hollow of his throat. He looked dishevelled, wild in a way that the Duke of Whitmore never allowed himself to be. He carried a half-empty crystal tumbler of amber liquid. He closed the door softly behind him and leaned against it, staring at me. I did not stand up. I remained in my armchair by the fire, a heavy wool shawl wrapped around my shoulders. You are in the wrong wing, Your Grace, I said, my voice deliberately flat. Lady Genevieve's rooms are in the east corridor. He ignored the barb. He walked slowly across the room, his stockinged feet silent on the Persian rug. He stopped beside my chair, looking down at me. The firelight cast harsh, flickering shadows across the sharp planes of his face. You dug up the roses, he said. His voice was thick, slurred at the edges. I did. Harrison said you ordered turnips planted. They are hardier. They survive the frost. I looked into the fire, watching a log crumble into glowing red embers. unlike delicate things. Nathaniel sank heavily onto the edge of my bed. The mattress groaned under his weight. He rested his elbows on his knees, staring into his glass. "Why are you doing this, Beatrice?" he asked, sounding genuinely pitifully lost. "You have been punishing me for a week. You are cold. You are cruel to her. She has done nothing to you." The sheer arrogance of his delusion snapped the last tether of my restraint. I stood up, letting the shawl fall to the floor. I walked over to him, snatching the glass from his hand and slamming it onto the bedside table. The crystal rang sharply. "She has done nothing to me." I demanded, my voice shaking, with a rage so profound it felt like a physical sickness. "She hasn't had to. You did it for her." He looked up at me, blinking slowly, defensively. "I have never raised a hand to you. I have provided for you." "You hollowed me out." I didn't shout, but the words tore from my throat with a visceral violence. I pressed my hands to my chest, digging my fingers into my own collarbone. "You took a living, breathing woman and you hollowed her out to make a vessel for a ghost. You dictated my clothes, my soap, my tea. You made me walk and talk and smell like a dead man's wife, so you wouldn't have to face the fact that you weren't man enough to claim her when you had the chance." He shot to his feet, his face flushed with sudden volatile anger. "That is enough. You do not know what you are speaking of. I was penniless when she was of age. Her father sold her to a baron to settle debts. I couldn't save her, so you bought me instead," I countered, stepping into his space, refusing to back down. "You use my father's dirty coal money to save your rotting estate, and then you use my body to play house with the woman you actually wanted. And I let you." The admission was a bitter pill choking me as it went down. "I let you do it because I thought if I fit the mold perfectly enough, you would eventually love the woman inside it." Nathaniel stared at me. The anger drained out of his face, replaced by a horrifying, stark realization. He looked at my hair, at my severe dress, at the rigid, unforgiving set of my jaw. He reached out his hand, trembling slightly, and tried to touch my cheek. I flinched back so violently I nearly tripped over the hem of my dress. "Don't!" I hissed. The smell of him brandy rain and that faint clinging scent of lavender from whatever embrace they had shared in the parlor downstairs turned my stomach. "Do not touch me. I am not your reliquary, Nathaniel. I am not a shrine for you to worship at when the real goddess is asleep down the hall." His hand fell to his side. He looked suddenly sick. "Beatrice, I have always cared for you. We have a good life, a quiet life, a quiet life." I repeated, a humorless smile twisting my lips. "Yes, it was very quiet, because I was busy erasing myself so you wouldn't be disturbed." I walked over to the door and pulled it open. The cold draft from the hallway swept in. "Go back to her," I said, my voice entirely drained of emotion. The rage was gone, leaving only a cold, barren exhaustion. "Go and play your tragic romance. But know this, Nathaniel. From tomorrow, I am no longer playing the understudy. You want Genevieve. You may have her. But you will not have me, and you will not have my money to fund your fantasy. Now get out of my room." He stood frozen for a long moment. He looked at the open door, then back at me. I saw the fracture in his eyes, the realization that the comfortable, compliant foundation of his life had just shattered irreparably beneath his feet. He walked out. He didn't look back. I closed the door. I locked it. I leaned my forehead against the cold wood, and for the first time in 3 years, I wept. Not for him. Never for him. I wept for the 22-year-old girl who had thrown away her expensive jasmine perfumes, believing that a man's preference was the same thing as his love. When the tears finally stopped, I wiped my face with the rough linen of my sleeve. The mourning period was over. It was time to dismantle the estate. I did not scream. I did not throw plates at the walls. I simply stopped the blood flow to the estate. The morning after I threw Nathaniel out of my bedchamber, I sat at the heavy oak desk in the office and wrote 3 letters. The first was to my father's solicitor in London, freezing the joint household accounts and transferring the remaining balance into a private trust under my maiden name. The second was to the estate manager, ordering an immediate halt to all non-essential repairs and halting the purchase of coal for the main house. The third was to the local tradesman, the butcher, the baker, the seamstress, informing them that any further credit extended to the Duke of Whitmore would not be honoured by me. I sealed them with thick red wax. I handed them to a rider and watched him gallop down the gravel drive, his horse's breath pluming in the freezing air. By Tuesday, the house began to starve. It started with the fires. Without the daily deliveries of premium coal, the servants were forced to burn whatever damp green wood they could scavenge from the fallen trees on the estate. The fires sputtered and hissed, producing a thin, acrid smoke that stung the eyes and left a film of bitter ash on the tongue. The grand sweeping corridors of Whitmore Manor grew bone-achingly cold. Then came the food. The elaborate roasts and imported wines vanished, replaced by salted pork root vegetables and thin ale. The house, which had once hummed with the quiet, expensive warmth of my father's money, suddenly felt like a damp cave. I adapted easily. I had grown up in the smoky industrial chill of a northern mining town before my father struck his fortune. I wore my thickest wool. I ate the salted pork without complaint. Genevieve did not adapt. I found her in the conservatory on Thursday afternoon. The glass walls, usually a haven of trapped heat, were entirely frosted over. She was huddled on a wicker chair wrapped in 3 blankets, shivering violently. Her lips were tinged blue. She looked up when she heard my boots on the stone floor. The violet eyes were no longer luminous. They were red-rimmed and panicked. "Your Grace," she said. Her teeth actually chattered. It was a pathetic clicking sound. Is there no wood for the stove in here?" I stood over her. I looked down at the pale, delicate hands clutching the rough wool blankets. "The wood is being conserved for the kitchen ovens, Evie. We cannot afford to heat glass rooms simply for leisure." She stared at me. The polite, sweet veneer she had worn since her arrival was cracking under the sheer physical discomfort. "Nathaniel said the estate was thriving." "Nathaniel says many things he does not understand," I replied mildly. I walked over to a dying fern, touching its brittle brown fronds. He thought the estate was thriving because his accounts were magically replenished every quarter. He never asked where the water came from so long as his cup was full. Genevieve swallowed hard. "You froze the accounts." "I took back what belongs to me." She pulled the blankets tighter around her throat. She looked small. Not fragile and romantic, just small and desperate. "I have no money, Beatrice. The Baron. He left me nothing but debts. I came here because Nathaniel wrote to me after my husband died. He promised I would be safe. The words hit me, but the impact was dull. A week ago, knowing Nathaniel had reached out to her first would have destroyed me. Now it just felt like another line item on a ledger I was closing out. "He promised you a safety he did not own," I said. "I cannot survive in this cold," she whispered. A single tear escaped, cutting a clean track through the faint layer of soot on her cheek. "I am not like you. I cannot be hard. I need comfort. I need to go to London. I have an aunt there, but I have no carriage fare." I looked at her, really looked at her. I didn't hate her. The rage I had felt in the dining room was gone, replaced by a clinical, sterile clarity. She was not a mastermind who had come to steal my husband. She was a woman drowning, and Nathaniel had thrown her a life raft made entirely of my money. Now that the raft was sinking, she was looking for another piece of driftwood. She didn't love him any more than he loved the real living version of her. They were both in love with an illusion of the past, funded by my present. "I will purchase your train ticket to London," I said. Her head snapped up. Relief washed over her face, naked and greedy. "You will—" "First class, departing tomorrow morning," I said, turning my back on her. "Pack whatever you manage to salvage from the rain. I suggest you do it quickly before your fingers go numb." I left her shivering in the glass room. I didn't do it out of kindness. I did it because paying her to leave was the cheapest way to amputate the rotting limb from my life. Nathaniel found out that evening. I was in my bedchamber packing. My trunks were open on the floor. The room smelled of camphor and dust. I was folding a heavy riding habit when the door burst open. Nathaniel stood on the threshold. The cold of the house had seeped into his skin, making his sharp features look gaunt and sallow. The manic energy he had possessed when Genevieve first arrived was entirely gone, replaced by a frantic, hollow panic. "She is leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. "Tomorrow at 9, I confirmed, not looking up from the trunk. I ran my hands over the rough wool, ensuring there were no creases. "I have arranged the carriage to take her to the station." He stepped into the room. His boots left wet, dirty tracks on the Persian rug. "You drove her out." I stopped folding. I slowly stood up, my spine cracking slightly in the freezing air. "I didn't have to drive her out, Nathaniel. I simply stopped paying for the firewood. The cold did the rest." "You are a monster." He breathed, his voice trembling. "She is grieving. She is weak." "She is pragmatic," I corrected him coldly. "She realized that a penniless duke in a freezing manor is not a romantic tragedy. It is just a tragedy. She is leaving because you cannot afford her." He flinched, as if I had struck him across the face with a riding crop. "She loves me. She loved the fire in the drawing room. She loved the roasted mutton. She loved the idea of a soft place to land. But you have no soft places left, Nathaniel. You only have me." I pointed to the heavy ledgers stacked on my desk. "And I am done cushioning your reality." He stared at the trunks on the floor. His eyes darted from the packed clothes to the empty wardrobe, the realization finally breaking through the fog of his delusion. "You're packing," he said. His voice dropped an octave, scraping against his throat. "I am going back to Yorkshire, to my father's house." Panic, pure and unadulterated, finally fractured his face. He crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbing my arm. His fingers were freezing, digging into the thick wool of my sleeve. I looked down at his hand until he slowly, hesitantly let me go. "Beatrice, you cannot leave," he stammered. "You are my wife." "I was your banker," I said, "and your housekeeper, and your audience, but I was never your wife." "That isn't true." He ran both hands through his hair, pacing in front of the fireless hearth. "I care for you. I do. This past week, it has been madness. Seeing her again, it confused me. It brought back the past. But the past is gone. You are here. We built a life here. You fixed this house." "I fixed the roof," I said quietly. "I didn't fix you. I will send her away," he pleaded. He stopped pacing and turned to me. His eyes were wide, begging. Not for my love. I saw that clearly now. He was begging for the warmth to return to the radiators. He was begging for the butcher to send the prime cuts again. He was begging for the quiet, organized silence of his life to resume. He was looking at me the way a man looks at a load-bearing wall when he hears the ceiling start to crack. "You don't have to send her away, Nathaniel. I already bought her ticket. Then stay." He took a step closer. He tried to soften his voice, trying to find the gentle, melancholy cadence that used to make my heart ache with the need to protect him. "Please be. I know I have been a fool. But we can go back to how it was. We can plant the roses again. I will learn to drink my tea the way you like it. I swear it." The offer was so pathetic, so tragically empty, that it actually made my chest physically ache. He was offering to play the same twisted game, only this time he would be the one contorting himself to fit my shape. "I don't want you to drink my tea," I whispered, the exhaustion settling deep into my marrow. "I don't want your apologies. I don't want you to pretend to love me because you are terrified of the dark." I walked over to my washstand. Sitting next to the harsh lye soap was a small glass vial. I had purchased it from the apothecary in the village that morning. I uncorked it. The heavy, intoxicating, unapologetically sweet scent of pure jasmine bloomed in the freezing air, obliterating the faint smell of camphor and wood smoke. I dabbed it on my wrists. I touched it to the hollow of my throat. Nathaniel watched me, his nose wrinkling slightly at the pungent floral scent. It was a smell that commanded attention. It was a smell that refused to be ignored. "What is that?" he asked softly. "It is jasmine," I said, putting the cork back in the vial. "It is loud. It is overwhelming. And it is my favorite scent in the world." I picked up the heavy brass key to my bedroom door and tossed it onto the empty mattress. It landed with a dull, final thud. "I will have the solicitor draw up the separation papers," I said, not looking at him anymore. "You will retain the house. I will provide a small monthly stipend to keep the estate from falling to the bank on the condition that you never contact me again. But the luxury is over, Nathaniel. You are going to have to learn to live in the cold." I didn't wait for his response. I walked out of the room, leaving him standing alone in the freezing dark. The morning I left Whitmore Manor, the sky was a brutal, blinding, cloudless blue. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a hard frost that coated the world in a shell of glittering ice. The gravel crunched loudly beneath the wheels of the carriage waiting at the front steps. I stood in the foyer, wearing a heavy dark green travelling coat. My trunks had already been strapped to the back. The house was dead quiet. Most of the servants had been let go the day before, with a month's severance paid from my private account. Only Thomas and Martha remained to manage the skeleton of the estate. Genevieve had left an hour earlier in a separate hired carriage. I had not gone down to see her off. Martha told me she wept as she climbed inside, shivering violently under a thin wool blanket. Nathaniel had stood on the steps and watched her go, but he had not tried to stop her. Now it was my turn. I pulled my leather gloves on, smoothing the fabric over my knuckles. I could smell the sharp tang of the frost mixing with the heavy jasmine oil on my skin. A shadow moved at the top of the grand staircase. Nathaniel stood there. He was wearing the same unbuttoned white shirt from the night before, his face shadowed with a dark stubble. The winter light streaming through the high windows caught the grey in his hair, illuminating the deep lines of exhaustion carved around his mouth. He looked like a ghost, haunting his own life. He did not walk down the stairs. He stood near the top landing, his hand gripping the polished oak banister. We looked at each other across the vast empty space of the foyer. The silence between us wasn't comfortable anymore. It wasn't the silence of understanding or shared routine. It was the silence of a battlefield after the artillery has stopped firing, a heavy, ringing emptiness full of wreckage. "Beatrice," he called out. His voice echoed off the marble floor, sounding thin and reedy. I stopped at the front doors. I didn't turn fully around. I simply looked back over my shoulder. "If you walk out that door," he said, his knuckles turning white on the banister, "the scandal will ruin you in London. A woman leaving her husband. Society will not forgive it." I felt a small, genuine smile touch the corners of my mouth. It was the first time I had smiled in a week. He still didn't understand. He still thought I was playing by his rules. He still thought I cared about the opinions of the people who sat in warm parlours drinking tea out of delicate cups. "I am the daughter of a coal miner, Nathaniel," I said, my voice carrying easily across the cold distance. "I was ruined the day I was born with soot on my hands. Your society only tolerated me because my father bought my way in. I no longer require their tolerance. I prefer the dirt." I turned back to the doors. Thomas stood there holding one heavy oak panel open. He looked old, his face lined with quiet sorrow. "Safe travels, Your Grace," Thomas murmured, bowing his head. "Take care of yourself, Thomas," I said, stepping past him. "And tell the new boy not to overstoke the kitchen fires. The flues are old." "Yes, ma'am." I walked out into the biting winter air. The cold hit my face like a slap, waking me up entirely. I climbed into the carriage, the leather seats stiff and freezing against my back. I did not look up at the windows of the manor. I didn't need to see him standing there watching his bank account and his warmth roll down the driveway. "Yorkshire, ma'am?" the driver asked from his perch, his breath pluming in the air. "Yorkshire," I confirmed. The driver cracked the whip. The horses lunged forward. The carriage wheels ground against the frozen gravel, a harsh, rhythmic crunch that sounded like bones breaking. But to my ears, it was a hymn. I leaned back against the leather. The carriage swayed as it hit the main road, leaving the high iron gates of Whitmore Manor behind. I took a deep breath. The air inside the carriage smelled of old leather freezing wind and the loud, overwhelming, beautiful scent of jasmine. I was 25 years old. My heart was fractured, my pride was bruised, and my hands still bore the tiny white scars from pruning a dead woman's roses. I was not a heroine in a romance novel. I had not found true love, and I had not been miraculously saved. But as the carriage picked up speed, rattling toward the north, I looked down at my hands resting solidly in my own lap. I had saved myself. And for the first time in 3 years, the space beside me was entirely perfectly empty. Thank you for listening to Beatrice's story. If you felt the chill of that empty manor and the triumph of her final departure, hit the like button to show your support. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who needs a reminder to never play the understudy in their own life. Subscribe to our channel and ring the bell for more deeply human emotional stories every week. Tell me in the comments, did Beatrice make the right choice leaving them both with nothing? Let's talk about it.